Due to the length of the recording, we decided to separate it into two parts. This is the second part with the questions. Moving right ahead and moving quickly, we will go to questions. I'll read the questions so that everybody knows what they are. So one comment that we had, we did make reference to how is COVID-19 affecting, and our attendee that asked that question said that in their case, it has interrupted transportation and they can't transport their products to clients. I know in New York State that we are dumping milk now, so it's going to affect everybody who thought maybe they were seeing a light at the end of the low-price dairy tunnel here in the States. The next question, canola meal minimum or maximum percent in cow, Daniel, or a cow TMR ration? I think you covered that, but if you want to touch on that real briefly.
Yeah, please. Sure. Yeah. Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Yeah, I think it was well covered. Is there a minimum? No. I mean, I guess the question would be, why would you, unless you have a volume that you have to feed, then there would be no reason to put a minimum on, because most of the time I find that the canola meal, depending on price, and in most regions that we work in, we find that canola meal is roughly 70 to 75% of the price of just regular solvent soybean meal. So in those cases, I find that it would typically go to the maximum percent. One question I get a lot from farmers is me and Amber both, is when should I switch protein ingredients on my farm? For example, sometimes soybean meal might come in at within 10 to 15% of the price of canola meal. And we try to help our clients take a long view on something like that. If it's just for 1 month where it seems like they can get a spot price on soybean meal that's going to be more attractive than canola meal, then that's maybe not the best to take those cows off of canola meal and over to soybean meal if it's only going to be for 1 month. We try to get our clients to look at things in these 6-month windows. And that's typically the period of time that they, in the regions that we work in, that they can book canola and soy products would be for roughly 6 to 8 months out. So maximums, we haven't had any problems with going to 4 to 5 kgs of the total diet dry matter intake. But in most cases, we don't need that level. Usually we can get away with 3 kgs. We do feed a little bit of soybean meal with these diets. Typically, it's a heat-treated soybean meal. Once in a while, we'll feed some other protein byproducts like distillers or gluten feed, depending on the situation. So.
Okay. Thank you, Daniel. I'm going to try to bundle as much as I can some questions, but I won't necessarily catch them all. So while we're on the topic of canola meal, minimum, maximum in a TMR diet, let's go to one that is, what criteria is taken into account when including canola meal into the TMR?
Criteria. Okay. Well, I think the first thing is I don't know where that question's coming from, which country, but depending on the country of the dairy operation, I think the first criteria should be, what are you buying? It's funny, in Canada and US, I mean, we just don't worry. If it's canola meal, it's generally canola meal. You don't have to question it. But in other countries, I would seriously, that would be the first question, is what are the levels of erucic acid and glucosinolate? Because unfortunately, there's rapeseed meal with high gluc rapeseed meal that gets into the feed chain, and as many people in other countries have witnessed, that can have very, very bad harmful impact on dry matter intake, reproduction, and milk yield. So it's best to avoid that. So the first thing is, what is your canola meal? The other thing we have to ask in Canada and the US is, what's the level of oil in that canola meal? There is a large processor that does leave a certain amount of oil in it. It's an expeller, somewhat of an expeller meal. I think my tests have shown that it's 6 to 7% of unsaturated fatty acids that are left in that product. It's not all unsaturated fatty acids, but majority is. So we have to have a knowledge and a test to see to make sure we understand what we're feeding. So in those cases, we may want to limit the polyunsaturated fatty acid content of the diet if we're trying to avoid milk fat depressions. But if we don't mind our milk fat going down, then it really may not play into our decision on that. So I'll just leave it at that.
Okay. Next in that, in sort of that same area of conversation, and just to sort of and add to what you just said, I know we were working with doing a training for a person in India, and his concern was that the Canadian canola meal is very different than what he's able to get, and they aren't able to feed as much. Let's see. So I do have a question. I'm going to just give this real briefly, and maybe this is something that you can answer really quickly, and then we'll go back to more about inclusions. So if you are buying canola meal from a place that perhaps doesn't have as good a quality canola meal, or has a canola meal that you have to be careful about, how do you contact people in Canada? I'm kind of assuming the Canola Council would be a good place to start. Am I wrong on that?
I'm sure.
Good. As we hear from Brittany. Yeah. So
that question there. So great question. And I would direct you to Canolamazing.com, and you can see that link right on the left-hand side of the screen there. You'll see a cow and an exclamation mark. So head over to Canolamazing.com. If you scroll right to the bottom of any screen, if you just go to the home page there is a tag there that says buyers. And that's at the very, very bottom of the screen. So you can click buyers. That will take you to a page on the Canola Council's website that has information and contact information, email, phone number for all companies in Canada that sell canola meal. So that would be the best place to go to look for a source of canola meal that is direct from a Canadian processor.
And if I were extraordinarily clever, I would navigate to that right now. But I have 3 screens going, and they're big, and I'm afraid of losing track of questions. So yeah, just go to canolamazing.com, and I'm pretty sure it's intuitive, and you'll be able to find it. A really quick one. So, and this is something, and then we'll get back to inclusions. Question from Eastern Europe: canola meal versus rapeseed meal.
I think Daniel brought out the main differences. The proteins are fairly similar with respect to escape protein and the amino acid profile, but the differences are in the erucic acid, which is used more in the refined oil industry in Europe than in Canada. And the other is that the glucosinolate levels are higher. And other than that, there's differences in yield and that kind of thing. But basically, I think the anti-nutrient factors are higher in the European meals.
Okay, thanks. Let's see, I'm going to go back to where I was. Changing from soybean meal to canola reduces the ME in the diet. What ration changes do you make to compensate for this?
Yeah, that's a good point. And when you use the least cost optimizer function of AMTS, then we can check that ME or metabolizable energy box to have the computer help us get to the ending that we need to. A lot of times when I switch from soybean meal to canola meal, I take it as an opportunity to try not to change much of anything else. So, for example, if the diet currently has 3 kgs of soybean meal, or no, pardon me, let me say 2 kgs of soybean meal, and we have to then we're switching to canola meal, and we need to feed 2.4 kgs of canola meal, for instance, to achieve a similar amount of crude protein and and also, well, mainly crude protein. So I take that opportunity sometimes just to make just that one change, just to see how the cows respond. And then once I get about a week or two into that type of ration change, then I typically go and tweak the formulation on minerals and MP, ME. Now, sometimes the cows produce the same, even though the computer is telling us that the ME and MP might be slightly lower. So if that's the case, then I just accept what the cows are telling me, assuming that they're not losing body condition score. But if we go back and look at some of the meta-analysis that have been done on canola meal, I generally have a lot of trust swapping soy for canola, and not worrying as much about that ME and MP, because a lot of the meta-analysis already shows us in many trials that on average those cows will produce an extra 1 kg of milk on that canola meal based diet. So that gives me a lot of flexibility to accept that lower level of ME and MP and still have a little bit more milk yield that I can rely on, just that the canola meal brings in. So, but if I am trying to get super geeky on my computer and try to get that ME and MP just right, then oftentimes I just reduce the forage a little bit. So I allow the effective fiber in that diet to go down a little bit because I trust that I'm going to be getting some chemical NDF or just neutral detergent fiber from that canola meal that wasn't there in the soybean meal to begin with. So I'll just let that forage go down, and then it's made up partly with a little bit more NFC from corn or barley or whatever your source is, and typically I typically see positive responses when I switch to canola in that format. So
the other thing to point out, Daniel, is that if we're using the up-to-date values, if you were using something like, the older method of determining indigestible fiber, the ME comes out quite low. But if you use the values that are currently in AMTS and the ones that are on the website that are based on actual digestibility determinations, the ME is higher than the perceived value based on older publications.
Yeah, good point. Very good point. Yeah, that's something that we picked up on over the past few years as well. Is just updating our canola meal value and using that exactly what you just said. Essi, good point.
Okay, while we're discussing the MEMP issues, let's move a little bit to amino acids. So I have two. One is asking specifically, do you think it's important to pay attention to threonine and leucine amino acids in high-producing dairy cows?
Yeah, I don't have a lot of comment on those two amino acids. I'll be honest, I don't like to talk in areas that I'm not highly or at least have some experience in. So Essi, maybe you want to take that question on.
Yeah, I think canola meal has a good amino acid profile, and I think that's part of the success in using it. But as far as formulating, I think that we're becoming more and more accurate in our ability to predict the amino acid requirements of animals. And I think it's worth looking beyond just simply methionine and lysine. And I like looking at all the amino acids. I find that sometimes arginine is important. The branch chain amino acids are important. And I think it's definitely worth looking at. If for some reason you go back over your ration and you're tickety-boo on methionine and lysine, but you happen to have some other things that are out of line, it's worth considering, because I think we are, particularly looking at some of the Cornell analysis, we tend to be getting some better amino acid values for a lot of the ingredients, not all of them, but we're getting there. So I think, yes, we want to look at them.
Okay, and in that same line, what are the different amino acid in comparison of soybean meal and canola meals? And again, you may have already answered some of this, but it probably is worth reiterating.
Do you want me to stick handle that one?
Sure.
Okay. I think that if we look at canola meal and we look at the escape protein profile, we'll find that we get as much escape protein from 1 pound or 1 kilo of canola as we do from soy. And even though soy has 50% protein, canola has about 40, we're still seeing that same ratio. So I think on that basis, what we're getting from the canola, that's the first limiting amino acid is methionine. So we're seeing that we're getting methionine and arginine. We're a little bit lighter on the lysine, but actually when we put it on a pound per pound basis, it's not as much as one would perceive. So I think we need to look at the amino acid profile of the escape portion, and that is fairly similar to a microbial protein. So if we compare those two things, I think we see that we do have a pretty great profile for canola.
And one of the things I can say, if you're working in the AMTS program, is in the feeds section, you can actually do a feed comparison, and you could put soybean meal and canola side by side and get a feel for how they may be different. And it may just help you do some of that comparisons. I will move to another question unless somebody had more to say on that.
Nope, we're good.
Okay, so and I apologize if you covered this because I was doing other things and not always listening to the answers. Sorry. How do nutrient values between Canadian and European canola meals differ?
I think we mentioned this a bit. The nutrients, the amino acid profiles, the protein, the fiber, those appear to be fairly similar. And I think what we're seeing that's different is the levels of erucic acid and glucosinolates. I also don't know if we have as much solvent extracted in the European meals as what we do in the Canadian North American meals. I think there might be more expeller meal.
Okay, thank you, Essi, and I apologize for double asking. I just, I know I wasn't attending very carefully when you...
It's an important question.
when you asked earlier. Let's see, so I have a question that I'm going to ask and then maybe defer, give you an opportunity to defer. This is it possible to omit alfalfa from a ration in the future due to drought conditions of the earth and its price? And I am just going to encourage, and I know that this person joins our webinars quite often. I'm going to encourage him and anybody that's interested in this question to our April 9th webinar with Frank Mittler. I'm sure he's covering topics like that. Essi and Daniel, go ahead.
Okay, yeah, I'll handle this one. That's a good question. I mean, it's perhaps depending on the region that you're in, whether you're farming in a desert or in an arid, semi-arid, or a temperate area. That may be a very good question to ask. Do cows have a requirement for alfalfa? I think we'd all agree that the answer is no. But the question is, what is the alternative? Obviously, alfalfa contributes NDF, effective fiber, and crude protein. However, there's many other feeds that also contribute the same thing. So if environmental, challenges are going to limit alfalfa production in a certain region, then I guess the question is, it sort of brings into context, like, what's the sustainability of that farm in that area is one question. But the other question is, how can that be mitigated? What feeds can be grown that require possibly less water, which there are very few feeds that require less water than alfalfa, right? Because it's deep rooted. But really, what can be grown other than alfalfa? And the second thing is, what can be imported economically? The fact is that cows do not need alfalfa. I mean, it's a beautiful feed. I think we all love it, but it's definitely not a nutrient, a requirement of a cow. So.
Okay, thank you, Daniel. Now I'm going to move to, I have a really quick one, which will result in a shameless plug. Are the results of NDF software similar to AMTS, or you rate AMTS higher? I just want to add that NDS and AMTS both are based on the CNCPS model, and if you're using the true model values, then they should have the same results. If they are not, it's like sub models that have been added in. And so just be aware of that. Daniel, you can go ahead and sing our praises. And I'm going to tell people, I'm going to tell people that anybody that's listening to this that's not presently using AMTS is welcome to email me about a free trial. You get a 30-day trial. So that's all. I'm done plugging.
Yeah, that's. I mean, that's not over the top, that plug. I think that's very good. I've been using AMTS for 10 years, I think. Maybe a little more or less. I can't remember, but it's. I mean, I think a ration formulator is like a bank or a dentist. I mean, you usually only have one or two in your whole life, right? So I mean, it certainly works well for us. It's evolving every few months, or maybe even more often. There's updates, so that gives me the confidence that it's being continuously improved. And as Marianne said, I mean, these programs are both based on the same biology. I think the differences are more in the face plates and in some of the but more or less the calculations are going to be similar because of that biology being the same. So yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Daniel. And yes, I just to emphasize, it's if they are both using the CNCPS part of their programs, and I'll leave that at that too. Some more questions. We'll go to, when we talk about fatty acids in milk, most milk fat is in micelles, in globules, and only expresses itself when homogenized or the fat is broken up in the milk. The taste and characteristics of fat and milk still need to be looked into, and is milk processing issue rather than a feed issue?
Oh, I'd say it's a feed issue.
It can be both. Just from experience, it can be both, and it depends on how it's treated afterwards, especially if it's in higher fat. But yes, quite often it can be a feed issue. So,
yeah.
All right. Next question. Let's see. So in getting farms to getting into farms, how do you use canola to replace distillers, which is getting hard to find and costly? And what are your thoughts on raw soybeans and canola combinations on farms?
Okay, yeah. I'll try to handle this question. I think we got to look at some of these ingredient replacements or ingredient availability issues as being temporary. I mean, a lot of the stuff is just to do with two things, really, depending if you're in Canada, US, or abroad. But a lot of the corn, a lot of the transport was disruptive earlier this year, so that affected the abilities for some of the processors to continue production at full steam ahead. And then now we're seeing the COVID-19 disruptions in production and availability and transport, obviously, because in some places there's lockdowns or severe restrictions, I guess, outside of Canada and US especially. So I would, but to answer your question, canola displacing distillers, I mean, they're really two different feeds. I mean, yes, they're both protein feeds, but that's about where the similarities end. Canola is 42% dry crude protein on a dry matter basis, the typical Canadian solvent. Canola meal is 42% protein. Distillers is far less than that, I guess, depending on how much oil's in it. There's obviously the makeup is much different. Methionine level in canola is quite a bit higher. So we're going to have a lot of, by swapping a diet from distillers over to canola meal, we're going to have, the canola meal is going to bring a lot of things to the party, so to speak, and design a nice diet. So there certainly wouldn't be any issues. Sometimes what happens is some of the distillers that's being fed might be 11% crude fat. So you're getting a lot of metabolizable energy in some cases from that crude fat. So that's got to be taken into consideration. In other scenarios, there's obviously it provides a lot of bypass protein, corn distillers, because of its heat treatment. But I mean, the question is, what are you protecting that's that useful to the cow? I mean, it doesn't have a lot of lysine or really much methionine. So I mean, what are you protecting? There's not a lot of amino acids that are going to escape rumen and make a huge contribution to the cow's total diet. When the price is right, distillers makes a lot of sense, though, for sure, because it does provide some level of protein. It's fairly palatable. So I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah, I have one comment that people might want to think about is that if you're using distillers, you have corn grain and you have corn silage, then basically most of your protein looks like corn, and that may become, as you use more and more, it becomes a little bit more difficult to try to balance if you're using amino acid balancing, because you've got such a high concentration of your protein from just corn products.
Yeah, good point, Essi. Yes. Yeah. If corn distillers is making up the majority of your supplemental protein, then it does become very challenging to obey any thumb rules on amino acid formulation. So unless, of course, we use supplemental sources.
And I was just add, if you're a person out there that's using our program, we do have a new function that's called Feed Pricing Analysis Tool, and it can help you, it can guide you towards the relative values of different feeds, and that's in the feed screen. If you have questions about that, just email me. I am the person attached to the webinars at Ag Model Systems email, so I will get it to the right person if I can't answer it. Next question, and this is getting to Daniel's coaching area. So sometimes we assume that every dairy farmer wants to excel and are very particular managers, but sometimes we face a farmer that is not very fussy. How do you, when you encounter this, and what approach do you take to spur them on to better management?
Yeah, that's a good question. Of course, we all come across different people. We all work with different people, and like I said earlier, that's part of the fun, is that we're not working with one. Not every dairy manager is the same. But here's what I find when we use the approach of client-centered methods. We're going to find a way to work with that client no matter what. There may be by asking that client what's important to them. I mean, I think that the person that asked that question, you may agree that I think everybody wants to do better if they feel that it's in their best interest economically, and if it's not too difficult. I think everybody wants to do better. I think a lot of times in a farm where production is not extremely high, there may be just some issues with getting there. Like maybe there's just not enough. Maybe the knowledge isn't there, and that's where you can help as an advisor, is to give that producer the confidence that the production can be improved by doing this, and this. So that's where the coaching methods really come in play, because not only as an advisor do we act as a coach or a client-centered method, we also have to act as an advisor when the time's right. We have to help boost the confidence of that producer that yes, things can be actually improved. And really, it goes back to peeling the onion peels back, is just trying to understand, why that producer wants to be where they are, or why they don't want to improve, and just talking about it more and building up that confidence, showing them showing them things that their peers are doing, showing them research, showing them, giving them all kinds of examples. I mean, there's many methods. So.
Okay, thank you. I want to make sure I don't miss any. And this is a two-part question, and they're not necessarily related, but I'll ask them as once so that I don't forget. How often do you do silage sampling on a single unit? And what's your target ratio using methionine when feeding rape? So go to the sampling first.
Yeah, okay, sure, yeah. It's a pretty easy answer. We use a deep, we call it the super probe. It's something we build ourselves. It goes down 14 to 16 feet. And we just have extensions that are 2 feet in length. So we can core all the way from the top to the bottom of a bunker silo. And if it's for example, a 200-foot pile, then we might do 3 samples, front, middle, and back. And then we've got a really good mapping. We can map out the silage quality well ahead of time. And if it's any deeper, then we can just use more extensions and probe and cores to get right down to the ground or the floor. So we typically do 3 samples on a bunker, no matter the length. And then if there's drastic differences between each core result, then we go back the next time and do one more in between those two to try to get a better mapping as to when that forage is going to change. We do a lot of the forage analysis in the fall. And where we work, we tend to get snow on top of the plastic or ice. So we like to get it done before that time, which could be any time between September and January, depending on the year. So that's how we go about forage analysis. If we're not left with no other option but to do face sampling, then we try to do it once a month or whenever it's necessary.
Daniel, have you ever videotaped that for your LinkedIn page?
No, I didn't.
Okay.
The difficult thing is holding the phone with one hand.
You need
recording.
Somebody to help you.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Or a GoPro.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So.
While you're on the sampling, before we get to methionine, are those 3 samples analyzed separately?
No, we usually do it all at the same time. It all depends on the time. I mean, we usually go into we sort of use forage analysis as something to do after we get the really important stuff done, like talking to the client, looking at the cows. If a sample needs done, we do a sample. If we have time, for example, if there's cropping going on and the manager's not available to speak, then we typically do as much sampling as we can when the weather's right. We're working at AMTS to do a series of videos that will help people on things like that. And as soon as Tom Taluki's released from quarantine, because he was traveling, he has promised me that he'll go out and demonstrate taking a forage sample. So you'll have his take on it. I'm hoping within the next few weeks. Excellent.
And then the next part of that was your target methionine ratio.
Yeah. So what we do is we try to listen to we try to take the advice of the amino acid supplier themselves, and just we formulate generally to what they are recommending. But in most cases, it's around 1.1 of grams of digestible methionine to ME ratio. So 1.1 on AMTS. That's one of the outputs that we can use. So.
Okay, thank you. And we are winding down on questions. So when looking at feed efficiency, the questioner assumes you're talking about more in reference to management tools, for example, bunk space, quality of mix, quality of ingredients, etc. Have you considered body size when looking at feed efficiency? Also, going forward in the industry, we have studies being done on conversion, genetic influence. What will be your thoughts if through genetics you can reduce dry matter intake by 10% and still maintain present milk levels, pounds per kilogram?
Yeah, and that's a very good point. Tim has made. Excellent thought went into this question, and I can tell that Tim, that you have some experience in this area. So to answer you, I mean, you got to take into account that we're dealing with a pretty homogeneous genetic base here when we're looking at feed efficiency ratio on our clients, right? I mean, we don't have drastic differences in body weight. I mean, yeah, some herds are smaller than others, but we don't have enough data collected that would allow us to answer your question as to whether or not the body weight is affecting feed efficiency ratio. But there's certainly lots that can be retrieved from journals, I think, that address that somewhat. When we troubleshoot low feed efficiency ratio, this is a whole other webinar, by the way, but I mean, it's a matter of going into the barn and into the feed bunk and just watching what cows are doing, how much stock and density is there, what's the space per cow, what's the condition of the feet on these cattle. There's many things that have to be considered, obviously, and those are all things that are good habits for feed bunk and farm management, is observing those things. That all goes into feed efficiency ratio for sure. You make a good point. If through genetics reduce dry matter intake by 10%, still maintain present milk levels. Well, I think generally that's our goal of everybody, is to reduce the amount of dry matter intake it takes to produce that pound or kg of milk, right? Of fat corrected milk. So I think that's the whole purpose of looking at feed efficiency closer and making it one of the more important numbers on our farm. I hope that everybody can talk about feed efficiency ratio just like they talk about the milk production per cow. I really hope that our industry gets to that point where we can talk about compare feed efficiency numbers, like many other numbers that we compare. So,
yeah, last fall I had an opportunity to listen to a very interesting talk by Darryl Mulfer at Riverview on what they've been doing with feed efficiency and their breeding. So. While we're talking feed efficiency, what would be, do you have experience with feed efficiency for grazing with supplementation?
No, unfortunately not. I wish I did, but I can't comment on that with any level of good knowledge. Sorry.
Okay, thank you. Let's see. And I'm not sure, I know that we can't use BST here in the States. So, and I'm not sure about Canada, but what would you expect improvement of feed efficiency values in herds injecting BST?
Yeah, certainly an improvement. I mean, the U.S. has used BST up until recently, obviously, and that was part of the point of using it was improvement in feed efficiency ratio and higher production per cow. We don't use it in Canada. It's never been approved. And many of the countries that I've been to working, most of them don't use it. So I don't have a lot of experience myself with it. I'm sorry I can't answer the question well.
Sticking with the feed efficiency, is your feed efficiency the same for jerseys?
Oh my, that's a political question.
Yes, it is. And you know they're the best breed cat. You just know.
Oh my. Well, let me say it this way. I think I think as dairy managers or advisors, consultants, whatever you are, I think what we have to focus on is controlling what we can and coping with what we can't control. So if we're dealt a Holstein herd, then it should be our goal to improve the feed efficiency ratio, because that makes financial and economic sense for that farm. All that said, I don't have a lot of Jersey herds, but I tend to see the few that I've looked at over the years, I do tend to see a very nice feed efficiency ratio on Jersey cows, especially when you use the 3.5% fat corrected milk feed efficiency ratio. So
I can't even get my own son to back me up on that. So whatever. So let's see. I have a question. In Ireland, the industry authorities and Greens, I'm assuming that means people, environmentalists, have the farmers brainwashed into the 5-ton primary grass cow, which I believe is a recipe for poverty. I believe the 12-ton confined TMR cow would work very well there in Ireland, about 2.5 times the margin. And there is an export market for prepared grass-based TMR. What would your main points be for both systems, if you have experience to speak to this?
Well, I don't know exactly what the person means by 5-ton versus 12-ton.
I believe, Essi, you could correct me.
yes.
I believe it relates to the size of the sort of the breeding and what they're saying. This is the cow to use because this is how much she requires, rather than bigger cows. Could I be reading that wrong? And maybe he'll pop in and tell us. No. Here's what I meant.
Could be production.
Sorry.
Could it be production per year? No?
I'm going to wait and see if he says. I know they're very seasonal there. And I know that there's very little, let's see, I probably got more information.
5 tons of milk versus 12 tons.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So 12 tons being 12,000 kgs or 26 to 27,000 pounds per lactation cycle, perhaps, or 305 days, however you look at it. We're talking what I think what Mr. Doerr's talking about here is just a low input cow versus a higher level management cow. I mean, yeah, John, I mean, that's a good question. I mean, I think it just depends on where you're farming. I mean, if that makes sense or not. I mean, clearly if land is cheap and, which there's very few places obviously in the world where land is cheap anymore. Then perhaps that low input cow is going to be fairly profitable. But I mean, obviously to get 12 tons of milk production, I mean, we got to feed that cow like a marathon runner, and we have to manage her like she should be managed and cared for. We have to pay so much attention to welfare, housing, silage quality, grain quality. I mean, there's so many things that go into producing that 12,000 kgs of milk yield. What do I think is more sustainable? I don't know. I'm going to sit on the fence on this one. I mean, I work in the industry where farmers tend to focus on high production per cow because it makes economic sense. And I'll tell you, when I see a herd that's making a lot of milk production, I don't think they're using. I think they're using less resources than those herds that are producing half that volume in relation to just resources and energy and whatnot. So my take is that higher efficiency is correlated with higher production per cow in general. But the way you get there is got to be with high quality forage, high quality grains, and trying to just minimize the impact that we're having on our air and our waterways. So.
And John, if you look back through the nutritionist webinars in 2019, we had Michael Deneen, who's from Ireland. He's been getting his PhD with Mike Van Amberg at Cornell, and he's been applying the CNCPS to grazing situations. So you may find listening to that webinar helpful, or contacting Mike Deneen. I know that a fair amount of what they're doing in Ireland is somewhat based on tradition. And we were there this past fall and visited a couple farms, and they're definitely hesitant to move from what has always been done to perhaps some of these zero graze systems where they're bringing the forage actually to the cows, and instead of having them graze for it. So that might be a good resource, John.
John's, yeah, and I know John from LinkedIn. I mean, John's been a dairy manager in many countries, being in some of the Gulf states and also at back in his home country of Ireland. So he's got a really, I know, John, you have a really good introspect on this already, but it's a good question you ask. So.
I have one remaining question unless I get more. So this is in Europe, we have up to 25, I'm fuzzy on the moles. Can you see that?
That would be micromoles per gram.
Micromoles per gram glucosinolates what could be maximum amount of rapeseed meal in a diet that includes like that?
I'll pass the puck to you guys on this one, Essi or Brittany.
Brittany, do you have a comment, or should I handle it?
Well, I guess I would, I'll let Essi handle it. I'll maybe kind of speak a little bit more to some other species when we have a lot of data around how much canola meal you could feed to the poultry, swine, etc., where we might have some stages of production that are more susceptible to those anti-nutritionals. And, it's a tough one. I think the data we have really around Canadian canola meal, our glucosinolate content tends to be, I think we even have a reported average value from our survey work of like 3 micromoles per gram. The occasional sample can be higher than that, but it really, really is low. So we always, with our Canadian meal, it's like virtually not an issue really in any diet that we feed. I'll pass it to Essi to talk about what would be how you would handle a 25 micromogram meal.
Yeah, I think some will depend on what the level of production of the cows are. Obviously, if you have higher producing cows that represent, they're going to be eating more, so it's going to represent a different amount depending on that. But I have seen, I think out of some of the Scandinavian countries, they're limiting canola meal to 2 to 4 kilos per cow per day, but I don't know how that relates to their production, their milk production and intake.
Okay. Unless someone adds a question, I think that I want to thank everybody for attending, and Daniel and Essi certainly for such a great question and answer period. Everybody who asked questions, everybody who listened to the questions, thank you. We will have this recorded and people can then review it at their leisure. It's quite a long webinar, and I apologize for anyone who wasn't able to get on earlier, but we fixed it now. Everybody, and Brittany, thank you for bringing all this together. I want to encourage people who are still here to make sure you check out the next ones. Let's see, let me find the right slide. Yes. So do email any of us and we'll get you the right information for this, but we'll be doing another webinar in about a month. Very good. So thank you, everyone. I will close out the webinar if I don't get any more questions quickly.
Thank you very much, and good health, everybody.
Yes, yes. Thank you so much, Daniel.
Welcome.
Yep. Bye, everybody.
Bye.